say modern conflicts, unfortunately the first region that comes to mind is the Middle East. For a myriad of reasons, which we talked about in another video, the Middle East has been engulfed in a spiral of permanent violence for almost a century. The Israel-Arab conflict is at the center of many of these wars. Now that Lebanon is increasingly seeming to be one of the possible battlefields of this round of the Israel-Arab conflict, we have decided to describe the previous wars in Lebanon. Welcome to our video on the 1982 Lebanon War. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. After gaining its independence from France in 1943, Lebanon became one of the cultural centers of the Arab world. It was one of the relatively prosperous and more stable countries of the Middle East. The capital, Beirut, became known as the Paris of the Middle East. Lebanon was ruled by a system called confessionalism, based on the power-sharing agreement known as the National Pact, which was agreed upon when the country became independent. Power was shared between the Maronite Christians, whose representative was a president, the Sunni Muslims, who were represented by a prime minister, and the Shia Muslim community, who had a parliament speaker. The National Pact sought to give representation to major communities of Lebanon. It enabled the country to operate as a democracy of sorts, but by the 1970s, the Muslim population and the leftist forces of Lebanon got increasingly resentful of the system. They believed that the existing status quo primarily benefited the Maronite ruling elite. Eventually, tensions rose to a level of civil war in 1975. Along with internal factors, such as the rise of new societal forces that rejected the status quo in Lebanon, the influx of Palestinian refugees fleeing war was among the key factors behind the violence in Lebanon. The first group of Palestinian refugees came to Lebanon in 1948, after Israel won the first war against the Arab coalition, and thousands of Palestinian Arabs were displaced or fled the war. In Lebanon, Palestinians were housed in temporary camps. They were not granted citizenship and lived as stateless refugees. The law barred them from owning property and working in dozens of professions, effectively marginalizing Palestinians in Lebanon. In 1969, Lebanese authorities agreed to cede the governance of the Palestinian refugee camps to the Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1971, Jordan kicked out the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the organization relocated to Lebanon. As a result, these refugee camps quickly became militarized. So when the civil war started in 1975, Palestinians sided with the Lebanese national movement of other Arab and leftist groups, which fought against the Phalange militia of the Christian Maronites. Israel supported the Maronites in the civil war with weapons and advisors. In a rather peculiar turn of events, Syria also intervened in the civil war on the government side, putting them against the PLO. By late 1976, the situation had quietened down a bit, but by then, Lebanon had become fragmented, with the Palestinian forces largely in control of the southern regions bordering Israel. This allowed the PLO fighters to shell Israeli territory and conduct regular cross-border raids. In one of the attacks, known as the Coastal Road Massacre, the PLO killed 37 Israeli civilians. Israel retaliated by invading South Lebanon up to the Litani River, killing some 100 PLO fighters. But this 1978 invasion also caused major civilian suffering, killing thousands of Lebanese and Palestinians, displacing over 200,000 refugees and destroying several villages. Following the adoption of Resolution 425 by the UN Security Council, and under heavy international pressure, Israel was forced to withdraw from most of the occupied territory. Still, it retained a buffer zone along the border. A Christian Shia militia group protected it, called the South Lebanon Army. Israeli support to the other side of the civil war prompted Syria to back the PLO against Israel once again. Even though Israel withdrew from most of Lebanon, the sporadic violence between Israel and the PLO continued in the following years. Simultaneously, fighting was ongoing between the Christian Maronites and Syrians. Israel presented itself as the protector of the Lebanese Christians, and many argue that they used this as an opportunity to weaken the PLO and Syria in Lebanon, and took steps to prevent any attempts for rapprochement between the Maronites and Syria. In July 1981, Israel launched a massive airstrike on PLO infrastructure in Beirut, killing some 300 people. In response, the PLO heavily shelled the border areas, forcing thousands of Israelis to leave their homes. Eventually, the United States brokered a ceasefire between Israel and the PLO, and it held for a while. The PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, reportedly pressured other Palestinian factions to uphold the ceasefire, since the Palestinians badly needed to avoid an all-out attack from Israel. But at the same time, Israel was preparing for a war to push the PLO out of Lebanon. According to the then Defense Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, they had been preparing for the war since his nomination as Minister of Defense in August 1981. Sharon proposed to launch an offensive on the PLO in February and April 1982, but Prime Minister Begin refused both times. Palestinian camps in Lebanon were subject to several Israeli airstrikes. On May 14th, the IDF Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan, stated that, "Having built up a military machine costing billions, I must put it to use. Tomorrow, perhaps, I will be in Beirut." The Israeli newspaper Davar reported about meetings held by Sharon and Eitan with leaders of Israeli settlements on the border with Lebanon, pressuring them to agree to an IDF attack on the PLO in Lebanon. Sharon reportedly stated the goals of this campaign, which included the destruction of the PLO, forcing the Syrians out of Lebanon, and ensuring a strong central government in Lebanon dominated by the Christians that was going to sign a peace treaty with Israel. The might of the IDF was also supposedly going to strike fear into the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank, and force them into negotiations with Israel. All the Israeli government needed was a pretext. A Palestinian group called the Abu Nidal Organization, which was not under Arafat's orders, gave this pretext to Israel. They tried to assassinate Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom on the 3rd of June 1982. Israel responded with airstrikes on the PLO in Lebanon, while the PLO retaliated with rocket launches and shelling. On July 6th, the IDF launched Operation Peace for Galilee, invading Lebanon from 3 directions. The initial invading force consisted of roughly 60,000 troops and 800 tanks. At this point, Lebanon's east was controlled by the Syrian army, the border areas and the coast north of Beirut by the Christian militia, and the coast to the south of Beirut by the PLO. The IDF's westernmost axis was along the coast, targeting 3 Palestinian camps near Tyre, with Beirut as the ultimate goal. In the center, 2 divisions were ordered to advance on Beaufort Castle, which was used as the PLO's stronghold, take the castle, and then split. The eastern axis was to advance into the Bekaa Valley. The critical axis was the westernmost. A success here would mean the defeat of large groups of PLO fighters, along with control over key cities, including the capital Beirut. Hence, the IDF's most potent grouping was going to attack the coast. The other 2 axes were secondary, aiming to support the first axis and keep the Syrian army busy, preventing them from defending against the IDF's offensive on the coast. On the first day of the war, the Israeli army made progress on all 3 axes, supported by heavy shelling and regular airstrikes. In the east, the IDF advance was also supported by the navy. Despite an overwhelming advantage in equipment, this was where the Israeli army also faced the heaviest resistance. The total number of the joint Palestinian and Lebanese forces was 10 to 15,000 men, and around 90 old T-34 and T-55 tanks, most of which could shoot but not move, according to a Knesset member. But this did not stop them from conducting damaging guerrilla warfare against the IDF. On this axis, the Israelis were forced to advance on a narrow road, which made them vulnerable to ambushes. An Israeli journalist wrote this about the PLO's resistance. The PLO fighters whom we had treated as rejects showed in this war a tenacity and intelligence which should not be underestimated. Israeli soldiers, who have shown contempt for the Fedayeen for years, have tasted this bitter truth most painfully. But this did not stop them from capturing Tyre on June 6th, even though separate pockets of resistance were still active in Palestinian camps. The IDF aimed to move along the coast as quickly as possible, sometimes bypassing points of Palestinian and Lebanese resistance in refugee camps, leaving that to be dealt with by units coming after them. In the central axis, 2 Israeli divisions bypassed the Beaufort castle on both sides, while the Golani Brigade was ordered to capture the castle and did so after a fierce battle with the PLO. By the end of June 6th, the forward IDF units had taken control of the critical intersection in Nabatea, which was one of the roads leading to the coast. In the east, the IDF captured Hasbaya on the first day of the battle, with other units advancing on the road to Rachaya. The Syrian army in control of this area offered little resistance in the form of shelling against advanced IDF units. On June 7th, the IDF's western grouping continued its advance along the coast. While the ground forces were getting closer to the next target, Sidon, the Sayeret Matkal Special Forces unit of the IDF landed north of Sidon to make sure that the PLO fighters in Sidon had nowhere to go. Israel continued conducting airstrikes, including the use of cluster bombs on the PLO positions. And since the PLO positions were often inside densely populated refugee camps, the use of cluster bombs caused a lot of civilian deaths. By the end of the day, the IDF was in control of the area around Sidon, but the Ain al-Haway refugee camp inside the city continued resisting. For almost a week, Palestinians continuously ambushed the Israeli forces, their tanks and vehicles. In the end, the resistance of the camp was defeated by unrelenting airstrikes. Meanwhile, the central axis reached Jazin, another important intersection town. 2 battalions of the 460th Armoured Brigade attacked the Syrian army inside Jazin and captured it after a day of fighting. The rest of the central axis continued moving north on the highway in the Bekaa Governorate. While the western axis continued advancing on Beirut, the main battles occurred between the IDF and the Syrian army in the following days. On June 9th, the Israeli Air Force, consisting mostly of F-15 and F-16 jets, engaged in a battle with Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 jets. The Israeli Air Force scored a resounding victory in a series of air battles, destroying more than 60 Syrian jets and almost 30 Syrian air defense systems on June 9th to 11th, ensuring complete air superiority in this war. This enabled the Israeli forces in Nabatea to advance in the Bekaa Valley, soon reaching the town of Rachaya. The central axis also reached the town of Ain Jalta and captured it after 2 days of heavy battle. From there, they moved on to the town of Ain Dara on the Beirut-Damascus highway. The Syrian troops initially took advantage of their positions on the dominant heights surrounding the town and prevented the IDF's advance. But the Israeli air superiority proved decisive here as well, as after a day of fighting, the Syrians had to withdraw from their positions in the area. At this point, the eastern axis of the IDF had captured Rachaya and was ordered to continue their swift advance. As a result, elements of the 90th Division were cut off in Sultan Yaqub, where the Syrians ambushed them. The Israelis eventually managed to break out of the encirclement, but not before losing 10 tanks and dozens of men in what was the biggest defeat of the IDF in this war. But still, it was a relatively minor wrinkle in what otherwise was a resounding victory of the Israeli army over the Syrian army in Lebanon. On June 11th, the sides agreed to a ceasefire, which effectively meant that now the PLO and the Lebanese fighters resisting the Israeli invasion were on their own. By then, the IDF had reached Kaldeh, the last PLO stronghold on the way to Beirut. On June 11th, the fighting there started, but a day later, a ceasefire was brokered by the United States between the IDF and the PLO. This ceasefire was very short-lived, and the IDF used this time to complete the encirclement of West Beirut, which had a significant Palestinian population from all sides including the sea. Very soon, the ceasefire fell apart, and Israel commenced a 2-month-long brutal siege of Beirut. While the PLO fighters were the declared target, thousands of civilians suffered due to indiscriminate shelling of the city and regular airstrikes. Electricity and water were cut off, and there was a shortage of food. There was a debate within the Israeli government about the necessity of a ground assault on the city. Sharon and Chief of Staff Eitan were in favor of this, but the rest of the cabinet rejected this proposal for fear of massive losses. Car bombs targeted several PLO leaders. Buildings suspected of housing them were destroyed, causing further civilian suffering. The Palestinians engaged in very active diplomacy to stop the siege. The Soviet Union offered moral and diplomatic support, even though they stated that the Soviet Union takes the Arab side not in words but in deeds, and is pressing to get the aggressor out of Lebanon. All the Kremlin did in practice was resupply the Syrian army, which had already exited the war after signing a ceasefire. The same was true for the Arab governments. They did not offer any real support to the Palestinian plight. The inability of the Arab government to influence the situation can be summed up in the ludicrous call of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi to the Palestinians to commit mass suicide in order to immortalize the Palestinian cause for future generations. However, the Palestinian leaders had much more success in winning the sympathy of the Western world and the Jewish community. The IDF tried to ensure that only favorable reports came out of Lebanon. Still, even some Western journalists, who were expected to have a sympathetic position, mentioned the widespread destruction caused by the war. An American journalist, Ellen Canterow, said this while traveling the coastal road. "What had first gotten to me was the dust. Under the wheels of our cars, the very earth had been savaged, ground to a powder by the millions of tons of steel rolling over it daily. It coated the windshield, gritted our teeth, stiffened our hair, and blotted our clothes. In the intense heat, getting out of the car and stripped of my press corps immunity, I discovered briefly what it might be like to be a refugee. Trudging by the roadside in the rubble and the dust that lay inches thick underfoot, I was reduced to human flotsam, dwarfed by the tanks, trucks and jeeps, while the dust lay everywhere. On the military arsenal moving north, on the refugees fleeing south, on ravaged buildings, the heaps of debris, the ghostly pall of war. The destruction was so pervasive it defied comparison. Throughout the streets of Tyre and in much of Sidon lay the rubble, ragged masses of broken cement, twisted metal, shattered glass, garbage. Corpses lay still under these piles. You knew them by their smell, unmistakable, as powerful as the gases from some putrefying swamp. As our reporter's convoy drove up the Lebanese coast one day, the ghastly odour of rotting flesh suddenly enveloped our car." Such reports helped the Palestinians win over the international community to a certain extent. On July 4th, Nahum Goldman, founder and former president of the World Jewish Congress, Philip Klutznick, president emeritus of the WJC and honorary president of the B'nai B'rith International, and Pierre Montfrance, a former French prime minister, made a statement calling for a political settlement through direct negotiations between Israel and the PLO. 2 days before that, Yasser Arafat was interviewed by an Israeli journalist and peace activist Yuri Avneri in West Beirut. On July 13th, Arafat's aide, Satawi, publicly stated that the PLO has formally conceded to Israel in the most unequivocal manner the right to exist on a reciprocal basis. Later, Arafat reiterated this stance to Le Monde. "We accept all of the UN resolutions concerning the Palestinian question," adding, "We do not forget that a UN resolution created Israel." A lot depended on the continuation of the American support of the Israeli invasion. The Reagan administration was aware that Israel was going to attack Lebanon, and offered tacit and sometimes outright public support to it. In the first half of 1982, the Pentagon delivered military equipment worth $217,695,000 to Israel. 15 M60 tanks were delivered after the start of the war. Up until the siege of Beirut, the United States refrained from any criticism of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, virtually the only nation in the world to do so. After that, particularly with the increasingly brutal and deadly nature of the IDF airstrikes on Beirut, the United States started being vocal, calling for a ceasefire and the exit of all foreign troops, Israeli and Syrian armies, along with the PLO from Lebanon. This was, in fact, quite close to one of the stated goals of the Israeli campaign, the exit of the PLO. But as the siege of Beirut continued, the United States tried to find a way for the war to end. In July, they halted the shipment of cluster munitions, but many argued that this step was small enough not to cause any problems with Israel. Eventually, the United States did manage to broker a lasting ceasefire. In August, the PLO agreed to leave Lebanon. Arafat's organization and some 15,000 members left Lebanon, and the PLO's headquarters moved to Tunisia. The IDF and Syrian troops agreed to withdraw from Beirut, and a peacekeeping force came to Lebanon to facilitate the evacuation and maintain the ceasefire. Now the full-scale war was over, but the violence continued. In August 1982, the Israel-backed Christian Maronite Bashir Gemayel was elected president, but less than a month later he was assassinated. In response, the IDF occupied West Beirut and blockaded the Sabra Shatila refugee camp. The Lebanese Christian militia was allowed by the IDF to enter these camps and carry out a massacre, killing at least 2,000 Palestinian civilians. This massacre caused outrage globally and inside Israel too. The Israelis organized a massive protest of some 350,000 men, calling for the resignation of Begin and Sharon. The Defense Minister Sharon and the IDF Chief of Staff Eitan resigned in 1983 under public pressure. Under the terms of the ceasefire, the IDF withdrew to a narrow security strip in the south of Lebanon. And even though now the PLO was not in Lebanon anymore, different Palestinian groups started emerging, which were independent of Yasser Arafat's organization. Some of them were Islamist. The continued occupation of Lebanon also prompted the emergence of another organization, Hezbollah. The Palestinian groups and Hezbollah harassed the IDF and inflicted casualties on the Israeli army throughout the occupation of South Lebanon, which ended in 2000. So in a way, Israel partially achieved its goals in the 1982 war. They ousted the PLO from Lebanon, and they created a buffer zone in the south. But instead of defeating the Palestinian resistance once and for all, as they intended to, the 1982 war and the relocation of the PLO led to the emergence of new Palestinian armed groups, many of which were more radical towards Israel than the PLO. Now Israel had to start dealing with not one but several Palestinian groups. And not just Palestinian groups. Hezbollah was another inadvertent offspring of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Both the aforementioned Palestinian groups and Hezbollah are at war with Israel to this day. Many soldiers and civilians died in the 1982 Lebanon War. According to the PLO, some 50,000 civilians died during the Israeli invasion, along with 5,300 PLO fighters. In Beirut alone, some 7,000 civilians died during the siege. By the standards of Israel, their losses from the war and the protracted occupation of South Lebanon had been relatively high as well, with 1,216 Israeli soldiers being killed in this period. We will talk about the conflicts in the Middle East more in the coming months. To make sure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.